Once you've created a data entry form using ASP.NET Server controls, you can then process those controls using server code written in either Visual Basic or C#. In this demonstration, I'll use a file called usingpostback.aspx that's a part of the Create Pages website. You'll see that it already has a data entry form consisting of 3 text box controls and 1 button. I'm going to use 3 additional controls to echo the data that the user types into the text boxes and display that data on the screen when the form is posted. I'll start by creating a panel container. A panel is an ASP.NET Server control that gets translated as a div tag set in the rendered HTML. I'll go to the toolbox, locate the panel, and drag it and place it in the page underneath the HTML table. Now I'm going to add 3 label controls. Once again, I'll go to the toolbox. To make this a little bit easier, I'll pin the toolbox, and then I'll drag in my first label, and I'll place it within the panel. With the label selected, I'll go to the Properties panel, and I'll change the label control's ID to fname label. Now, I'll click right after the label control inside the panel and press Enter. Notice that the cursor only goes down a single line. When you're within a panel container and you press Enter in Visual Web Developer, it creates a line break or an HTML break tag rather than a paragraph. Now I'll drag in another label and place it under the first. I'll set the ID for this second label to lname label, and then I'll repeat the process, once again clicking after the label control and pressing Enter, dragging in a third label, and I'll set the ID of this label as DOB label. Now, to process the data when the form is posted, there are 2 possible approaches. One is to use the click event of the Submit button. I'll do that in this first demonstration. I'll double-click the Submit button control, and that creates its associated event handler for the click event. The name of the event handler function is button1_click, and Visual Web Developer leaves the cursor inside that function so that I can start to code. Now I'm going to pass the data from each of the web form controls to the associated labels. For the first name, I'll use this code. fname label.text equals fname input.text. Notice that because I'm programming in C#, that I'm always placing a semicolon at the end of the line. I'll unpin the toolbox so I can see more of the code. And now I'll take that line of code and I'll copy it to the clipboard by pressing Ctrl+C, and then I'll paste it in by pressing Ctrl+V a couple of times. And I'll modify the second and third line as follows. For the second line, I'll change the ID of the label to lname label, and the ID of the input to lname input. And for the third line, I'll change the label to DOB label, and the input to DOB input. I'll come back to the page, save the changes by pressing Ctrl+S, and then select Debug, Start Without Debugging. I'll click into the first name control and type David, the last name, Jones, and I'll pass in a string which is a valid date of 5/1/1960. I'll click the Submit button, and you'll see that the page is sent to the server and then returned to the browser, and the label control text properties are reset to the values that the user typed in. If you look at the source code that was returned to the browser by right-clicking anywhere on the page and selecting View Source, and then you scroll down to the section that's displaying those labels, you'll see that each of the 3 labels was interpreted as nothing more than an HTML span tag, and the value that the user typed into the form control, that is the text box, was populated into the span tag by ASP.NET. Now, as I mentioned, that's one approach that you can use to handle postback data. Here's a second approach. I'm going to close the text editor that opened up and then close the browser, and then go back to my code file. You can also handle postbacks in the page load function. The page load function automatically loads when the page is loaded into the browser, both for the first time and when it's interpreted during postback. You can determine programmatically at runtime whether the page is being processed as part of a posting to the server by referencing a Boolean property that returns true or false called isPostback. So, for example, if I wanted to move this code from the button1_click event into the page load event handler, here's how I'd do it. I'd place the cursor inside the page load function and start with an if statement. Then within a pair of parentheses, I check the value of the isPostback property. Then I put in a pair of braces underneath the if clause. And now I'm going to take this code that right now is in the button click event, and I'm going to cut it, and then I'm going to paste it into the conditional if statement so that that code is only processed if the page has been posted to the server. I'll go back to the main page file and press Ctrl S to save the changes. Then once again run the page, starting without debugging. As the page loads the first time, notice that the label controls show their original or default values, simply the word label. But now if I type values in, such as Mike Smith, and a date of some kind, and then I click Submit or press Enter, once again you'll see that the label controls are updated.